But he doesn't know it's Jesus, right? Verse 34, who is this speaking about? He says to Philip. He needs to be taught who this suffering servant is. So what does Philip do? Verse 35, what are we all called to do? He opens his mouth, and beginning with this scripture, he told him the good news about Jesus. You can imagine Philip, can't you? Some of the things he might have said. Maybe he started with a passage like Luke 23, which explains and describes for us how Jesus was before Pilate and Herod, falsely accused, mocked, beaten, bruised, rejected, tormented, humiliated. And then the angry mob sentences him to death, and Pilate gives him up, and then he's on the cross, suffering for our sin. And then maybe also Philip would have mentioned Stephen's death. We've just looked at that as a church together. You know how the followers of Jesus suffered and died like he did? Or at least that's starting to happen, and that's being seen. But then he would have taken it at some point to the good news. And he would have said, listen to this Ethiopian eunuch. Jesus didn't stay dead, but he rose from the dead, and he conquered death and sin and all the powers of darkness. He ascended into heaven, and he's in heaven now, and he lives, and because he lives, we know that we who follow him will one day live too, forever, in blessing. And Stephen, he died, yes, but as he died, he had this vision of the glory of the throne room of heaven, and he saw the Son of Man standing there waiting for him. The glorious life that Jesus has is for all who believe in him. It's Philip's message in some form. How about you and me? We're just like Philip. You say, really? Maybe you are, Pastor. He's an evangelist, deacon. He's going around talking to people. That's what he does. It's kind of like you. Not me. I'm not like Philip. No, you're like Philip. We all are like Philip because you and I, together as believers, have the Spirit of God in us. And because we have the Spirit of God in us, we can speak. Doesn't matter how old we are. Doesn't matter how young we are. Doesn't matter how old in the faith we are. How established in the faith or how much of a new believer we are. If we have the Spirit of God in us, we can speak. And in fact, it's essential that we speak. This is how God's people of old heard the word. They heard the word being spoken to them, being taught to them, the word being opened up, and the sense of it being given. And Romans 10 tells us how can they call on the one they have not believed in, and how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? Hearing is necessary. How can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word about Christ. And so preaching, proclaiming the word is needed. Faith comes through hearing. That means those who preach are set apart for that task. But that also means all believers who have been called to be ambassadors of the gospel, to be spreading this message of reconciliation in Jesus. It's an essential task. And because it's essential, God will give us the words that we need. Do you believe that? Philip opened his mouth, yes. But it's the Spirit who led the way. It's the Spirit who caused him to speak with the Ethiopian eunuch and give him the truth that he needed to hear. And so you might be in a conversation with somebody and you might come away from that conversation feeling like a bit of a failure. Ever had that? I have. Why didn't I say this instead of that? Man, she wasn't connected with anything I was saying. When that happens, don't worry. Don't be too hard on yourself. Don't lose hope. God will do great things. God does great things. You know, when new converts come to faith in the context of this church, they don't do that because of my preaching. They don't do that because of your invitation to church and your kindness to them. All three of those things are really needed, really good. We're called to do that. God uses these things. But they come and they stay because the Spirit draws them. So we need to just follow his leading. We need to listen to him, and he will guide us. He will show us the way.